Now, training fatigue is obviously something that we need to manage well, but I think nowadays fatigue seems to be a bit of a boogeyman. Now, people either pull out at the moment that they feel a slight hint of fatigue or get poor externals, or they either keep smashing themselves through a brick wall regardless of how much excess fatigue that they're building up. Now, in this video, we will debunk 9 common myths about training fatigue and how you can understand fatigue properly to make better progress. Now, if you're new here, my name is Norman Chung. I've coached powerlifting for over 10 years and I've worked with 4 university powerlifting clubs as well as several international competitors. Before we go through the myths and misconceptions, it's important that we actually define this thing that we call fatigue. Now, we think it's an obvious idea in our own minds, but actually isn't when it comes to who we ask. Now, fatigue is a word both coaches and athletes use, but can mean 2 different things to each party. So they're not 2 completely different things, but if we were to draw a Venn diagram of what athlete and coaches mean, there are going to be 2 overlapping circles. When athletes refer to fatigue, they may refer to the overall experience of being in a psychologically and or physiologically tired state. Now, this may well include the effects of generally training hard or not having good externals or being under-recovered. Now, athletes may refer to the combination of symptoms that may include brain fog, sleepiness, low motivation, soreness, or even stiffness. Now, all of these experiences may well coincide with drops in performance in training, but not always. Now, there are times when athletes can feel horrible, but suddenly find themselves performing much better and even break PBs, which moves us onto what coaches would think when it comes to talking about fatigue. Now, in the eyes of the coach, at least for my case, they are thinking more about the immediate physiological effects that inhibit objective performance, and that's part of the fitness fatigue model. Now, these negative effects are inevitable part of training, but varies depending on the training that the athlete performs. Now, sometimes the athletes can feel energetic and fresh, but exhibit fatigued performance. Also, sometimes the athlete can feel tired and exhibit better performance. So let's go through 9 common myths about training fatigue in powerlifting. Now, the first one is going to be that there's CNS fatigue when lifting maximal loads. Honestly, if I had a pound for every time that a powerlifter says that my CNS is fried. Now, if you don't know what CNS stands for, it stands for central nervous system, which is comprised of the brain and the spinal cord. Now, when you want to activate a muscle, the brain sends a signal down the spinal cord and through the peripheral nervous system, and then into the muscle fibers. So when your CNS is fatigued, what that means is that there's a drop in our ability to voluntarily activate a muscle in max effort. So even though that muscle fibers itself can produce force, the signal coming through to activate the fibers is reduced. Most people think that low reps and high intensity cause more CNS fatigue than high reps, but this is not true. The higher the training intensity, the CNS activation is higher, but this does not necessarily lead to much CNS fatigue at all from a practical standpoint. Actually, CNS fatigue is more likely to accrue from long duration and low intensity work, i.e. extremely high repetitions, particularly from endurance and cardiovascular training. Now, here are 2 papers that looked at the different resistance training protocols, and they both failed to find any evidence of CNS fatigue. Now, the second myth is that we need to optimize to reduce fatigue all the time. Now, I think once upon a time when Westside Barbell was considered mainstream, many lifters used to train too hard and accumulate too much fatigue and increase injury risk unnecessarily. Nowadays, I'm starting to see some lifters pathologize fatigue at all costs and shy away from being fatigued at all costs. And the consequence of that is that you end up training not very hard at all. The thing that you need to understand is that fatigue is inherently consequential to any training stimulus. And there is a time and place to push hard, higher levels of fatigue, relatively speaking, and that there is a time and place to manage the fatigue to let performance come through. Ultimately, this will lead to the inevitable periodization of training. Now, if you want to find out more about how hard powerlifters should train, check out this video here. And the third myth is that high fatigue is inherently dangerous. Not quite fully true. A moment of high fatigue from hard training or high intensity training that produces drops in performance isn't always injurious. But what matters more is managing the spikes in training difficulty that is often associated with higher risk of injury. According to this paper titled Training Load and Fatigue Marker Associations with Injury and Illness, a systematic review of longitudinal studies, it says that acute change in training load showed a clear positive relationship with injury, with other load/fatigue measures producing mixed associations, particularly acute and cumulative training load. So if you are a lifter who benefits greatly from higher intensities from training that produces high fatigue, that's not a problem. Just manage the spikes in training load, which is what you need to focus on. And the fourth myth is that higher fatigue will eventually lead to higher supercompensation. Now, this is often a subsequent thought that the idea that more is always better. And if you didn't know, supercompensation in sports science refers to the adaptive response of the body to a training program. It refers to the process of creating new gains after recovering back to baseline after a training stimulus. Yes, overreaching to the point that you get a drop in performance will lead to more gains if you give yourself sufficient time and resource to recover from it. But there is going to be an inevitable ceiling to which that fitness response can be maximized. And the problem with chasing high fatigue from harder training is that you inevitably need to rest longer to just even recover back to baseline. So if you were to compare yourself to a hypothetical twin who's training in the Goldilocks range, he or she is going to surpass you in the rate of progress that they will make. So high fatigue from harder training will not always lead to higher supercompensation. And the fifth myth is that higher feelings of fatigue means that your performance will be low. Now, what I mean by this is that the idea of just because you're going into a training session feeling tired, sore, or even stressed out, that there is a preconceived notion that this will immediately mean that your training performance in that session will be bad, or at least will be worse than recently. And the truth is that you don't know how capable you are that session until you go through your warm-up routine and work up to your main sets. And how you feel psychologically and experientially does not always have a direct correlation with your physiological output. And this is where some people say how you feel can be a bit of a lie. Now, but the takeaway from this is not to completely ignore how you feel. The relevance of how you feel is not binary, like it's either relevant or not relevant. It's more about how relevant it is and how this evidence fits in with the rest of the picture. One thing that's also important to note is that whenever you are training, what you don't control is the output. But what you can control is the effort and the difficulty level that you're programmed to be training at. So for example, a single at RP8 is going to feel the same regardless of whether it's 140 kilos or 150 kilos. Which brings me on to the next myth. The sixth myth is that you should reduce training stress when you feel high stress. This is a myth also built up from the previous myth. If you are a normal person that goes through work or study with occasional changes in your week or months, you will inevitably go through varying fatigue and stress levels. Let's assume that this week there is a level of high stress, and this does lead to a reduction in performance for that program. It doesn't mean that you need to further manually reduce the training stimulus, like for example the number of sets or volume that you do, only if you feel like you're about to hit, RP10 or even fail sets, which is an exception. You should let the program play out to see what the long-term trend is rather than the short-term trend, which leads me onto the next myth. Now, the next myth is that you should deload straight away when your top set starts to go down. Now, one thing that's worth conceptualizing is thinking about fatigue that's contributed from training and fatigue that comes from everything outside of training. Now, this fluctuation from outside of the training may occasionally rock the progress slightly through a phase of training, and this can lead to a short-term oscillation in your top-end performance, or as I like to call it, noise. But the one thing that you shouldn't do is to deload the moment that you feel like your top end is about to reduce ever so slightly. And you need to focus more on the long-term trend of the reduction in your performance. If there is a long-term change in your externals, then you may want to revisit the training variables that you're training with. So you may want to consider deloading when it's also no longer a short-term drop, or when it's actually the end of a training block or mesocycle. And the next myth is that low RPE is low fatigue training. Yes, RPE, if controlled individually, can influence the difficulty and subsequent fatigue that you gain from training. But your proximity to failure is only one side of a multi-dimensional aspect of your training program. And you need to take into consideration of the number of sets that you're doing, as well as the equivalent percentage of your 1 rep max that you're doing. They all come together to dictate how hard training is, and subsequently the amount of fatigue that you will feel. So just because you're training at a low RPE, if you have a high number of sets, you may well end up accumulating quite a lot of fatigue purely from the volume. Which brings me to my next and last myth, which is that optimal training should make you feel fatigued to an extent by the end of it. Now, this is a very common mindset, and that's often stemmed from lifters who used to train for bodybuilding, but sometimes from insecurity or fear that a session might not be hard enough to stimulate optimal progress. Depending on who the lifter is, it's that some lifters may well need some easy sessions, namely on secondary days. And this may be important for primary days to be fresh enough for you to perform better. Because at the end of the day, we're not trying to optimize for some sort of sense of fatigue by the end of sessions. But what we do want is a more apparent and measurable level of momentum in progress. A good example of this is that personally I find that with some lifters, particularly big guys, certain sessions just need to be a lot easier. So easy that their training RP is barely reaching RP5. If feeling very little fatigue on some sessions is what you need to see good progress, then there's no value in necessarily changing that just for the sake of feeling like you can. So I hope you guys found it useful, and if you guys got any other myths that I've missed out, comment in the box below. And as always, click like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys on the next one.